June 4th, 1943. Norfolk Naval Base. After 2 weeks at sea, Unteroffizier Hermann Buscher stepped off the transport ship expecting hostility, fear, or at least tension. Instead, he walked into a world that contradicted everything Nazi Germany had taught him about America. The docks moved like a living machine. White workers, black workers, women in overalls guiding cranes, children selling newspapers beside warships. No one screamed, no one hid, and no one stared with hatred. Sailors walked past the German prisoners as if it were an ordinary Thursday morning. "Die Spinnen, die Amerikaner," Buscher whispered. The Americans are crazy. That moment would stay with him for life. In his memoir, Behind Barbed Wire, he wrote that Norfolk looked less like a nation at war and more like a country too confident to even notice its enemies. The base stretched over thousands of acres. Dozens of ships were loaded and unloaded at once. One morning's cargo surpassed a week's output from Hamburg, yet what stunned the prisoners wasn't the scale, it was the casualness. Civilians wandered freely. A brass band played swing music. Vendors sold donuts next to destroyers. America did not hide its strength. It seemed to take it for granted. Then came the first shock to their worldview. American officers addressed the prisoners in fluent German and calmly read the Geneva Convention rules as rights, not privileges. Some guards had clearly Jewish surnames. They issued Red Cross packages and asked prisoners if any needed kosher meals. Many Germans laughed, assuming it was sarcasm. It wasn't. Medical inspections shattered another belief. Wounded Germans received the same penicillin American soldiers received, medicine Germans in Africa had never seen. Black and white American medics worked together without hesitation. A black technician drew blood from German officers. In Germany, this would have violated law. In America, it was routine. Their first meal deepened the confusion. German prisoners were led to a mess hall where American sailors ate the same food only meters away. No separation, no degradation, no shouting. Instead of glares, Americans were focused on a baseball radio broadcast. Even the journey inland defied expectation. The prisoners were transported in comfortable passenger cars, not boxcars. Stations were full of civilians who looked at the prisoners with curiosity, not hostility. At Union Station in Washington, German soldiers watched American families send sons off to training camps, wives kissing husbands openly, children clinging to fathers in uniform. The same platform held US soldiers and captured Germans, and somehow the moment remained peaceful. As the train moved west, they saw something else Germany had never shown them: total transparency. Aircraft factories weren't camouflaged. B-26 bombers sat openly on runways. Workers' cars filled enormous lots. Steel mills glowed through the night, powered by an electricity grid, unlike anything the prisoners had imagined. Entire neighborhoods around these factories were lit, thriving, full of radios and cars. By the time they approached Texas, many of the soldiers realized they were seeing a country that operated on a completely different wavelength: abundance without fear, power without secrecy, confidence without brutality. And when they arrived at Camp Hearne, complete with electricity, hot showers, proper beds, recreation halls, libraries and hospitals better equipped than many in Germany, they began to understand what would eventually shatter Nazi ideology far more effectively than defeat on the battlefield. Camp Hearne, Texas, felt less like imprisonment and more like entering a parallel world, one that made no sense to men raised under totalitarian discipline. Built across 720 acres, the camp offered conditions that many Germans had never experienced at home. Barracks had electric lights, indoor plumbing, flushing toilets, and hot water. Every prisoner had his own bed with sheets and blankets. Recreation halls contained ping-pong tables, musical instruments, and shelves of books. Swiss Red Cross inspectors wrote that the living conditions surpassed those of many German civilians. The first surprise came from the camp commander, Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Stiles. He greeted the prisoners in fluent German and explained something unheard of in their military experience. Within the compound, the prisoners would largely govern themselves. They would elect barracks leaders, organize daily routines, and even oversee discipline among their own men. To Germans trained in rigid hierarchy, This gesture of trust felt bizarre, almost unreal. But the medical facilities stunned them even more. The camp hospital had X-ray machines, dental suites, surgical rooms, stocked pharmacies, and penicillin. When prisoner Georg Gartner developed appendicitis, he received immediate surgery from an American surgeon assisted by German medical staff. He later wrote that he had never experienced medical care of that quality in his own country. Then came the canteen, a store, an actual store, where enemy soldiers could buy cigarettes, chocolates, soap, stationery, even musical instruments, not with real money, but with pay earned from voluntary labor. German soldiers, raised to believe in harsh discipline and scarce rewards, were bewildered by the idea that prisoners could choose luxuries. By late 1943, America's labor shortage brought German POWs deep into Texas farms, ranches, cotton gins, and food processing plants. They earned the same 80 cents a day, on paper, as American privates, paid in canteen coupons. Under guard supervision, they picked crops, repaired fences, worked machinery, and observed an agricultural world radically more advanced than anything in Europe. At King Ranch, over 800,000 acres, bigger than a German state, prisoners worked alongside Mexican-American vaqueros and black ranch hands. Racial mixing in labor crews contradicted everything Nazi ideology taught them about hierarchy. Even stranger, these workers sometimes supervised the Germans, reversing the racial order the prisoners grew up believing was natural. Mechanization was another shock. Massive combines replaced dozens of workers. Trucks carried crops instead of horses. Planes surveyed cattle herds from above. American abundance wasn't a rumor, it was everywhere, casually displayed, not even hidden from enemy eyes. In food processing plants, the culture shock was even worse. At canneries, German prisoners watched perfectly edible produce thrown away for tiny imperfections. The waste felt almost immoral to men whose families were rationing bread back home. One prisoner wrote that Americans apologized for the waste, unaware that their waste was richer than a German household's weekly food. Even everyday social behavior unsettled them. American farmers openly criticized government policies in front of the prisoners, without fear of punishment. Teenagers flirted freely at soda fountains. Women drove trucks, supervised men, owned businesses, and even flew military aircraft as part of the WASP program. The sight of women piloting planes left many prisoners speechless. Some of the most powerful experiences came from local churches. Multiple congregations invited German prisoners to Christmas services. Mothers whose own sons were fighting in Europe sang German hymns to the enemy. The kindness pierced something deep. Several prisoners broke down, unable to reconcile the warmth in the room with the hatred they'd been taught to expect. By winter 1943, the prisoners realized something profound. They had entered a country that didn't simply defeat Germany with weapons. It defeated Germany with its way of life. And they hadn't seen the most shocking part yet. By early 1944, a quiet transformation was underway inside Camp Hearne, one far more subtle and far more powerful than any prisoner expected. What the Germans thought was simply a comfortable camp was actually part of a carefully designed re-education system, though they never recognized it as such. It began with the library. At first, it held a few hundred books donated by local Texans. Within a year, it grew to over 5,000 volumes supplied by the American Library Association. For the first time, German soldiers could freely read authors their own government had banned: Thomas Mann, Erich Maria Remarque, Jewish writers like Leon Feuchtwanger. Books that would have meant imprisonment in Germany sat openly on the shelves. No guard stopped them. No censor intervened. Shortly after, Sam Houston State Teachers College began offering correspondence courses to any prisoner who wanted them. Nearly 350 POWs signed up for classes in English, American history, mathematics, economics, agriculture, subjects that quietly taught democratic values. Professors visited the camp to lecture and administer exams, treating the prisoners like adult learners, not enemies. The camp newspaper, Das Spiegel, not the modern German magazine, became another unexpected vehicle of transformation. Early issues echoed Nazi loyalty. But as months passed, articles shifted. Prisoners debated ideas, questioned ideology, and wrote about what they had observed in America. It wasn't propaganda. It was simple exposure reshaping minds. Behind all this was the Special Projects Division, an American psychological operations unit disguised as an education office. Their strategy wasn't indoctrination. It was something far more effective, letting reality dismantle lies. Prisoners were quietly evaluated, anti-Nazis received leadership roles. Neutral men were guided into education programs. Hardline Nazis were isolated to prevent influence. Every letter they wrote, every book they borrowed, every conversation overheard in the yard helped the division map ideological shifts. Within 6 months, more than half of the neutral prisoners showed measurable democratic leanings. But the real lessons came outside the wire. In Texas factories and farms, German soldiers witnessed an industrial world far beyond anything the Reich could create. At the Alcoa plant, they watched America discard more aluminum scrap in a day than Germany could obtain in a week. At canneries, they saw entire batches of produce thrown out for minor cosmetic flaws, tomatoes too pale, corn off size, while German families at home rationed meager wartime food. In the Lone Star steel plant, monthly output exceeded what German mills had produced in a year. The speed, the coordination, the constant flow of trains and trucks. It felt impossible to POWs who had witnessed their homeland's industrial collapse. Even more disorienting was the behavior of ordinary American workers. They listened to radios while they worked, they laughed, they took breaks, and they criticized President Roosevelt openly without fear, criticism that in Germany would have meant imprisonment or death. America wasn't perfect. German prisoners quickly noticed contradictions in race relations. At Camp Hearne, some guards were black soldiers, men the Nazis believed inferior, yet these same men now held authority over them. But those black soldiers could not eat in the same restaurants that served German prisoners. They could not sit in the same theater sections. To many POWs, it was a bewildering paradox, an enemy treated better than some citizens. Yet even this contradiction planted questions. If America was willing to confront its own inequalities in public and still function, what did that say about a dictatorship that pretended perfection while collapsing from within? Christmas 1943 crystallized the shock. The entire town of Hearn donated gifts to the prisoners: cigarettes, candy, books, handmade cards. Church choirs learned German hymns. A towering 30-foot Christmas tree illuminated the camp with more lights than many German villages owned. The feast included turkey, ham, pies, and ice cream, a meal far richer than what their own families were eating in wartime Europe. For some, this kindness broke something deep. As one prisoner later wrote, "The Americans were not trying to win our loyalty. They simply behaved according to who they were. That was their power." By the end of 1944, thousands of German prisoners found themselves caught in the same quiet contradiction. They had been defeated militarily, yet treated humanely, raised in dictatorship, yet exposed to freedom, trained to believe in racial superiority, yet outrun by black sharecroppers in cotton fields. America wasn't what Nazi propaganda had promised. It wasn't weak. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't dying under capitalism. It was thriving, with a confidence so effortless that it didn't even require cruelty toward enemies. And that realization was the beginning of ideological collapse. By 1945, the German POW experience in the United States had become something far larger than imprisonment. It was slowly turning into an unexpected education in how a free society actually functioned. And much of what they learned had nothing to do with classrooms or lectures. It came from simply living in the orbit of American life, watching how ordinary people behaved, and seeing how work was done. At the Lone Star steel plant in Texas, prisoners were stunned by the sheer volume of production. One facility produced more steel in a month than Germany had managed in a year before the bombings began. What confused them most was that nobody barked orders or threatened workers. People were motivated by bonuses, pride, friendly competition, and a belief that their work mattered. It was a type of efficiency fueled not by fear but by confidence. Railway yards were even more unbelievable. Communication lines buzzed constantly. Trains arrived and departed with a smooth rhythm that seemed impossible without some authoritarian central command. Yet it all ran on voluntary coordination, private industry, and local decisions. German officers watched from work details and quietly admitted they had never seen anything like it. The shock continued in food processing plants. Perfectly edible food was thrown away because it didn't meet cosmetic standards. Tomatoes with minor blemishes, corn that was not uniform, fruit with small imperfections, all of it discarded. Germans who had seen civilians scraping for survival could not comprehend the abundance that allowed such waste. One prisoner later wrote that the Americans apologized to them for discarding food, never realizing they were apologizing for a level of plenty that was unimaginable in Europe. Agriculture painted the same picture. One combine could do the work of dozens of farmhands. Machines replaced animals. Trucks replaced wagons. Even small planes were used to track cattle. It was another example of a society whose baseline efficiency came from creativity rather than coercion. But the most powerful lessons came from observing the people themselves. Prisoners watched Americans talk about politics in ways no German could have imagined. Farmers complained openly about President Roosevelt and government inspectors without fear. Newspapers criticized war plans, mocked officials, and debated policy in full view of enemy soldiers who read those same papers in camp libraries. Public disagreement did not weaken the country, it seemed to strengthen it. Gender roles also challenged long-held beliefs. Women ran stores, managed factories, supervised men, and even flew military aircraft as part of the WASP program. For soldiers raised under Nazi ideology, where women were seen as mothers or little else, this sight was disorienting in the best possible way. Then came the contradictions of race. At Camp Hearne, some guards were black American soldiers. German POWs, raised on racial propaganda, found themselves taking orders from men their government had labeled inferior. And yet those same black soldiers could not dine in certain restaurants or sit in certain theater sections, while German prisoners could. The contradiction was obvious even to those who barely understood America. They were treated better than some American citizens, and the moral weight of that realization stayed with them. 3 personal stories show how deeply this transformation could go. Herman Bircher arrived in 1943 as a committed believer in Nazi ideology, but the kindness he experienced, especially at Christmas, dismantled his beliefs. He later immigrated to America, became a citizen, and worked for General Motors. Georg Gartner escaped a camp in 1945 but chose not to flee the country. He built a life in the United States for 40 years under a false name, and finally surrendered not from fear, but because he wanted his story told. Reinhold Pabel left his camp simply out of curiosity, lived in Chicago for 7 years, turned himself in voluntarily, and later became a naturalized citizen. Their stories were extreme, but they came from the same source. They had seen a better way of living. Other camps contributed similar lessons. Camp Alva trained prisoners in modern agriculture, skills they used to rebuild German farms after the war. Camp Concordia became a center of art and music, with orchestras and murals that still survive in Kansas today. Camp Trinidad, located in a harsh climate, gave prisoners better winter clothing and food than many German soldiers had ever received. By 1945, America even began preparing POWs for the world they would return to. The War Department offered vocational training in engineering, agriculture, medicine, city administration, and business. Thousands learned English, thousands more took courses that mirrored American college classes, and many were briefed on concepts that would later become the Marshall Plan. The Allies had already decided that Germany would be rebuilt, not crushed, and prisoners were quietly being prepared to take part in that future. The statistics confirmed how deeply these men had changed. Out of 425,000 prisoners, only 0.5% attempted escape, and nearly all were recaptured quickly. Sabotage was almost non-existent. Most prisoners volunteered for work. After the war, surveys revealed that a majority favored democracy, supported the Marshall Plan, and maintained ongoing contact with Americans they had met. Thousands immigrated, dozens became elected officials in the new West Germany. Many helped rebuild towns, farms, and industries using knowledge gained in Texas fields and American factories. By the end of the war, the quiet influence of American life had accomplished something that no battlefield could achieve. It had reshaped the worldview of tens of thousands of former enemies and planted the seeds for one of the strongest alliances in modern history. It did not happen through force or coercion. It happened because ordinary American life, its freedom, contradictions, abundance, and humanity, was more persuasive than any ideology they had ever known. When the war finally ended in 1945, German POWs in the United States did not simply go home. For many, leaving was far harder than arriving had ever been. They boarded trains knowing they were returning to a country in ruins. Their families were starving. Cities they remembered from childhood no longer existed. And unlike those who had fought on the front lines, these prisoners had spent their final years surrounded by abundance, stability, and the everyday predictability of life in America. Before repatriation, the U.S. quietly shifted focus from confinement to preparation. Camps became centers for reconstruction training. What had once been simple work details evolved into full educational programs designed to help prisoners rebuild a shattered Germany. They learned city administration by studying real American town governments. They observed agricultural planning that would later become essential in restoring German farms. Medical technicians practiced public health methods to combat disease outbreaks expected in post-war Europe. Engineers studied infrastructure repair, from roads to water systems. The American strategy was clear: send them home as the foundation of a democratic society rather than remnants of a defeated army. This approach extended even into sensitive areas. Future reconstruction policies, the ideas that would become the Marshall Plan, were quietly explained months before the public ever heard of them. American officials visited camps to outline the vision for a stable, rebuilt Germany integrated into a peaceful Europe. The prisoners weren't lectured about democracy. They were shown what cooperation, trust, and forward planning looked like. When the first groups finally sailed from New York to Europe, the statistics told their own story. Escape attempts had been nearly non-existent. Violence inside camps had declined sharply. Most prisoners worked willingly, not because they were forced, but because they had come to understand the purpose behind it. They had seen how a free society treated even its enemies, and that experience reshaped them more deeply than propaganda ever could. Repatriation ships crossed the Atlantic filled with men who were no longer the same soldiers who had been captured. Many stepped onto German soil carrying English textbooks, American newspapers, and letters from U.S. families they had grown close to. Some arrived home to mothers who had survived the war by bartering for potatoes. Others returned to discover their hometown no longer existed. Yet, mixed with grief was a sense of clarity. They had seen a country where open debate didn't weaken unity, where racial contradictions still didn't stop progress, where even enemies had been treated with dignity. It became impossible to return to old certainties. In the years that followed, the influence of former POWs spread quietly across West Germany. They helped rebuild towns with methods learned in Texas. They revived agriculture using American machinery practices. Many entered politics, advocating for cooperation instead of conflict. Some became teachers, shaping an entire generation with ideas they had absorbed in prison libraries and classrooms. Others entered business, using US-style management and production systems that German companies had never practiced before the war. Perhaps more importantly, they carried a new understanding of the world. They had lived inside a society that thrived on argument rather than obedience, innovation rather than rigidity, and opportunity rather than fear. That understanding helped anchor West Germany inside the Western Democratic Alliance. In countless interviews years later, former POWs repeated variations of the same message. America had defeated them not only with force, but with example. When Camp Hearne and the hundreds of other camps across the country finally closed, something remarkable remained behind. Former guards and former prisoners continued exchanging Christmas cards for decades. German veterans returned to Texas for reunions, walking the grounds where they had learned the first lessons of a life they could not imagine back home. Americans welcomed them, not as former enemies, but as old friends who had shared an unusual chapter of history. What began as captivity had become transformation. It happened not through pressure or indoctrination, but through exposure to ordinary American life, its freedoms, its contradictions, its generosity, and its confidence. Those simple, everyday experiences achieved something that military strategies alone never could. They turned enemies into allies, prisoners into partners, and soldiers of a defeated nation into citizens who would help build a democratic future. The true impact of the POW camps stretched far beyond the war itself. It lived on in the Germany that emerged from the rubble, in the Atlantic Alliance that shaped modern Europe, and in the men who returned home with a new understanding of what a free society could be. The United States had won the conflict on the battlefield, but its greatest victory happened quietly in places like Camp Hearne, one conversation, one classroom, one small kindness at a time.